Welcome. My name is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings together distinguished Georgetown University faculty and alums to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And today, it's an honor to present my friend and colleague, Professor Charlie Kupchan, to talk a little bit about his new book, which is just out, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Now, before I turn it over to Professor Kupchan, let me just say a little bit about Charlie. Charlie did his undergraduate degree at Harvard University. He then went to Oxford, where he did his master's and his doctorate. Charlie, I think, really embodies the School of Foreign Service ethos. And by that, what I mean, he is someone who is a skilled scholar and academic. He has published many academic works, a number of books, and distinguished articles, yet he has also been actively and rigorously engaged in the world of policy. He has twice been at the National Security Council during the Clinton administration, and then most recently during the Obama administration, where he was a special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs at the National Security Council. So Charlie is one of those people that brings together an understanding of the theory of international relations and has done the practice of international relations. So the way we're going to work this afternoon is I'm going to ask Charlie to talk a little bit about his recent book. Then we will open it up to questions from the group. I may ask a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to broader questions from our viewers. If you will look at your control panel, there is a question function. So please write your questions there. I will then read them and relay them to Professor Kupchan. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Charlie Kupchan.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a pleasure to join you. After that introduction, I have some big shoes to fill, so I'll do my best. And I'm going to start off with a political disclaimer, since we're in the election season, and that is, especially after last night's performance, I am not a major fan of President Trump, nor his America First foreign policy. That having been said, I think it behooves us as American citizens, as voters, as people who care about the country's role in the world, to harvest some lessons from the Trump presidency and to ask, what does his presidency teach us about where the country may be headed? And I want to use that as a springboard to talk a little bit about what's in my book. And I want to make three basic points. The first point is that I think the Trump presidency and the Obama presidency before that, because Obama, I think, was someone whose instincts were to pull the United States back from strategic overreach. But the two presidents together, I think, tell us that the United States is to some extent passing through a tipping point in which the robust, enthusiastic, unlimited internationalism of the post-World War II era seems to be abating. And I think we know why. It's partly because of overreach. The wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya have not gone over well. Globalization has to some extent worked to the disadvantage of many American workers. And so we are seeing this adjustment, this recalibration of American foreign policy in a way that suggests that the United States will be doing less in the years ahead, particularly on the military front. I saw this coming relatively early on. I started this book in 2011, 2012, and I felt that the public debate was changing. And to get ready to write this book, I said, you know what, I think I need to know more about what America and American foreign policy was like before Pearl Harbor. Because you and I, Tony, we both went to grad school, during the end of the Cold War. We've been teachers, professors after the end of the Cold War. We know a lot about this country since World War II, but many of us, and I put myself into this boat, don't know a lot about what the country was like before that. And so I started reading back to the founders, the 19th century, the early 20th century, and my head exploded because I found that from 1789 until 1941, far from being in this country that wanted to run the world, we ran away from the world. And I'll just tell you one quick story because I think it's illustrative. We were losing the Revolutionary War badly. And the founders went against their instincts and they reached out to the French to form an alliance in 1778, not because they wanted to, but because they realized it was the only way of achieving independence. The French said yes, they sent ships, they sent soldiers, and we won. In 1793, Britain and France went to war again. That alliance was still operative. The French, they called up George Washington on his cell phone. King had George on his speed dial, and he says to George Washington, George, we took your chestnuts out of the fire. What are you going to do to help us? How many troops and how many ships are you sending? And George hung up his phone and he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, in which he basically said to the French, good night and good luck. He reneged on the alliance. He backed away from that partnership that led us to independence, even though the French were again at war with the British. That alliance that the United States pulled out of in 1793 was the last alliance that we formed until after World War II. That just gives you some sense of how averse we were to entanglement abroad during much of the nation's history. So that's my first point. Let's keep in mind that the internationalism of the last 80 years is the exception, not the rule. My second point, again, this was a real surprise to me because I have grown up in a fishbowl in which American exceptionalism is the rationale for doing everything. We need to go put out this fire and that fire. We need to spread democracy. We need to bring China into the WTO because we are blazing a path toward a world of liberal democracy. Well, until World War II, we were an exceptionalist nation, but exceptionalism was a justification for staying out of the world. The basic formula was we cannot risk the American experiment in democracy and prosperity by tainting ourselves in an illiberal world, by venturing out, as John Quincy Adams said, to find monsters to destroy. And so there really was a sense that the United States could perfect the Union, could advance liberty, could advance prosperity only if it stayed out of trouble abroad. That version of exceptionalism is a very different one than we're used to, but it is one that I think Trump has been tapping into and which still has strong resonance in the American electorate, particularly in a world in which our efforts to promote democracy through intrusion in the Middle East haven't worked out very well, and in which illiberalism is on the rise. Democracy is actually in recession worldwide, in part because a pugnacious Russia and an ambitious China are leading efforts to create an alternative to a democratic and liberal world. My final point, I do not want to be seen as endorsing isolationism, far from it. I'm an internationalist, will always be an internationalist. That's who I am, it's in my DNA. That having been said, I do think, as I said, we need to harvest lessons from American foreign policy of late and realize that we are heading into a period in which we need to pull back, in which we need to be concerned about a precipitous retreat, because the conditions facing the country are actually very similar to those that prevailed the last time that we dangerously retreated from the world in the 1930s. We have a pandemic that is causing a recession very similar in scope to the Great Depression. Illiberalism is on the march. We have overreached, just as we did in the Spanish-American War and World War I. There is a nativism on the rise in the United States, very similar as in the interwar period, when we deported many Mexicans, when we passed in 1924 a draconian immigration bill. So there are signs of a turning inward in the country that I think we need to take seriously. And so my final thought is that we need to find a middle ground. We spent 1789 to 1941 doing too little. We spent 1941 to today perhaps overreaching and doing a bit too much. It's time to find the middle ground, to do less, but to still do enough. And in my mind, that entails three main efforts. One, to try to pull back from the periphery while holding in the core areas of Europe and Asia. Two, to rediscover teamwork. We can't do this alone in a world that is globalized, climate change, cyber warfare, social media penetration. We have to be a team player. And finally, I think we in some ways need to reclaim that earlier version of exceptionalism where we are the model, but not the crusader, where we recover our democratic credentials, where we refurbish and reanimate our democratic institutions and liberal ideals, so that once again, the United States is a model for the world, a country that others want to emulate. The United States has, on balance, tilted history in a positive direction since 1789. We need to make sure that we get back in that game. I'll stop there.
That's fantastic and an amazing tour de force, Charlie, sort of leading us through from the revolution to the present. The one thing I want to note also, in addition to Charlie's book, he has an outstanding essay in The Atlantic, which just came out. And I would recommend you buy his book, but you can look at the Atlantic piece today. So look at that, and it kind of lays out some of this. The one thing I've sort of seen in American foreign policy, and I think Charlie is wise in pointing this out, those of us who really came to fore during the late Cold War, after the Cold War, don't realize this, is it's almost like a roller coaster between periods, at least starting with, maybe the Mexican War and then moving forward, periods of engagement, in some cases foolish engagement, and then pullback, isolationism, and in many cases foolish pullback. And so it's kind of bounced back and forth. And really until the Second World War, we saw that. And then after the Second World War, it became one of engagement. One question I would ask is, it strikes me that the United States had a coherent foreign policy strategy that really began with, you can put the time period, but with sort of Kennan and containment, and continued through more or less the same until the end of the Cold War. And then when the Cold War came to an end, there seemed to be a period where the United States wasn't really sure where it was going, and there didn't seem to be the formulation of a strategy. So at least that's my sort of thesis. Given your 3 points that you just raised, which I think are wise, about pulling back, working on teamwork, and also understanding that exceptionalism in part means we're a model as opposed to an imposer. Let's just assume, or let's say that Joe Biden is elected, because I think we're going to see similar foreign policy if that doesn't happen, where we are. If Joe Biden were elected, and you could go into the Oval Office with those 3 themes, what would you tell the newly elected President Biden he should do in terms of some concrete steps to better secure the United States in its role in the globe?
Let me answer that very interesting question, Tony, with a brief historical overview, because you're right that we've seen these big swings in American history. From until the Spanish-American War, we refused to expand beyond North America. Many times proposals were put forward, let's take Puerto Rico, Haiti, Santo Domingo, Hawaii, Latin America, every time they were defeated. Then we hit 1898 and we do it. And we take Cuba and Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines, and guess what? Americans don't like it. Why? Because it was this realist, we became an empire, and Americans are not imperialists. So they pull back. We don't like this, forget it. Then Woodrow Wilson comes along and he tries the alternative course, which is idealism. we're not going to be an empire. We're going to save the world for democracy. Americans didn't buy that either, right? They wanted to know, well, why are we out there dying in the trenches? To save democracy? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. And then he says, well, okay, you didn't like the war, but you're going to love the League of Nations, right? What does the Senate say? No, thank you. So then we go back to isolationism because we didn't like the realist empire. We didn't like Wilsonian. And finally, FDR comes together and he puts realism and idealism together. That's the magic combination that creates liberal internationalism. And that was the foundation, this partnership between Democrats and Republicans behind power and partnership together through the Cold War. What happens in the 90s is that bipartisan center starts to come unglued. And the Democrats are largely the party of partnership, the Republicans the party of power and unilateralism, and the Cold War is over. And so the United States lost that sort of organizing principle. And I think that's really when overreach begins. And I think that's really the sources of this pickle that we're in today, where Americans are saying it's enough already, right? What about us, right? Let's tend our own garden, not solve other people's problems. So if I, just to kind of come to your question now, I would say to Mr. Biden, Mr. President, your first, second, third, and fourth priorities are here at home. They're the pandemic. They're the future of work. They're race. They're rebuilding a bipartisan center. Because if our lights are not on, and they are not on right now, Tony, I think you would probably agree with me, we're never gonna deal with external problems. And so I think whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think the next president of the United States really does need to get our own house in order. That's the starting point. The second would be to reach out and reanimate our democratic alliances. And I don't mean just NATO in form. I need to make sure that the liberal democratic world is alive and well, and that the nativists, the populists, the extremists are defeated. Because right now, this is a question that is in the balance. For me, someone born after the Cold, this is the scariest moment of my lifetime, scarier than the Cold War. Why? Because at least during the Cold War, our lights were on. I think we had our heads screwed on then. I'm not sure we do right now. And then third, after we sort of reconsolidate the liberal democratic world, then we need to work with our allies to deal with the big challenges of the day. China, Russia, climate change, nuclear proliferation. So I see it as concentric circles. Fix the country's problems at home, reanimate the democratic world. Only then can we deal with the broader global issues.
And that sounds like a good set of prescriptions, and also a good inaugural address, because there would be a sense in which it would be building on sort of where we are and trying to correct the problems here and then move forward. What do you think of the future of U.S. engagement? I mean, it's implicit in what you were saying in institutions, and I'll mention certainly the United Nations, NATO, connections with the EU. How should the U.S. see its role there? I know you've talked about leadership and being at the table, but not always sort of running the table.
Yeah, just picking up very briefly on our last exchange, I think that Biden kind of gets this issue, because his most effective moments last night were when he looked straight into the camera and spoke to the American people and said, I hear you, I'm going to look out for your back. So I think he gets that his urgent priority is discontent at home. On this issue, I think that there will be no going back to business as usual. That is to say, this kind of deep, embedded, multilateral, institutionalized world, for two reasons. One is that the world has changed too much. Back when the Atlantic democracies represented 75% of GDP, they could anchor global politics. China will have the world's largest economy in a few years. That changes the world, and we're going to have to figure out how to work with China, and how to deal with a multipolar world, which is still anchored by the democracies, but not in the way that it has been since 1941. The second thing that I think has changed is American politics, and in particular, the appetite of the Senate for the big multilateral treaties of yesteryear. I mean, do a thought experiment, Tony. Let's say that we took the post-World War II settlement, the UN, Bretton Woods institutions, NATO, and you and I got in a taxi, I guess it would be an Uber these days, and we went to Capitol Hill, and we took this package up to the Senate and said, could you ratify this afternoon? They would chase us off the grounds with a baseball bat, right? No way would you ever get that through today's Senate. That's not going to change, right? The Republican Party has really moved off the reservation when it comes to this kind of deeper embedded multilateralism. So I think that we have to go back to being a team player. America first is America alone, but it's going to be more flexible and informal than it used to be. I think it's going to be coalitions of the willing, concerts, contact groups, whatever format best suits the challenge. And in fact, I think we're already moving in that direction. Look at the JCPOA. Look at the six-party talks on Korea. Look at the Normandy format on Ukraine. It's very hard to get the institutionalized multilateralism that we used to have, so we're going to have to be more fleet of foot on that front.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, the thought experiment is one that I have thought of many times. I think there were 2 negative votes when the UN Charter was given advice and consent by the Senate in 1945 or 46. And yet, if we were to bring the Geneva Conventions before the Senate, so the Geneva Conventions on the laws of war, I have no doubt they would not be given advice and consent. So many of the embedded rules of international law would be rejected. Let me ask a question. So I also remember the days, and I worked as an intern many years ago on Capitol Hill in 1977 when Jimmy Carter was president, and there really was a very different Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a very different Senate, which was, you had your outliers, but was mostly bipartisan, collaborative, Republicans and Democrats working together with more or less a common mission. Do you see a return to that? I mean, is the Senate that we have today going to be, you know, business as usual for the foreseeable future? Or do you see the possibility of returning to more of a centered Senate?
I think that for now, we're not in a good place, and that the Senate of today and tomorrow is going to look a lot more like the Senate of 1919 than the Senate of 1945. And you mentioned the vote on the UN. I would remind everyone that the vote on the League of Nations, and the League wasn't very different than the UN in design. They took 3 separate votes, all negative. Woodrow Wilson then said, okay, I'm going to turn this over to the American people. And he said the 1920 election is a referendum on the League and America's engagement in the world. And the Republican candidate, Senator Harding, said, make my day. I stand for the policies of George Washington and against the internationalism of the president. Harding won in one of the most lopsided elections in American history. And so we ought to take a page from that experience. You know, given the predominance of smaller rural states, given that the Senate overrepresents those states when you look at the American population, I do think that this aversion to bipartisanship and to multilateralism is going to be with us for quite some time. The country overall, I think, is headed in a different direction if you look at it demographically. And younger Americans tend to be more multilateralist. They tend to have a different set of priorities. But if you're talking about President Biden, if he were to win, or whoever comes after him, I'm afraid that president is going to be riding roughshod over a very polarized country and a Senate that's very hard to control. I mean, I worked for President Obama. President Obama was a centrist, at least by my judgment. And when he would look behind him over his shoulder to make sure that that centrist coalition of Republicans and Democrats were there for him, hard to find it. I'm afraid that's the new normal.
Yeah, I fear you may be right. And you mentioned Warren Harding. I would encourage people to do this. Warren Harding spoke back in the day when you had these amazing floor speeches on the floor of the Senate, and he spoke against the League of Nations Covenant, and it was exactly what you would expect. He said, I don't believe in a super government of the world. The government of the United States is good enough for me. I mean, that's literally what he said on the floor of the Senate, and it reminds me of some of the rhetoric you hear today on the floor of the Senate, including connecting to opposing various other multilateral agreements, everything from the International Criminal Court to the Law of the Sea Treaty, but very similar to Harding's floor speech back in the day.
And I would remind everyone, Tony, that the America First Committee, right, yes, which is what Donald Trump looked to dub his foreign policy, took shape in 1940 to prevent Franklin Roosevelt from entering the war, making exactly the same kind of arguments that you just made, picking up on Harding. So we've seen this play before.
Exactly. Well, let's open it up to questions from our viewers out there. If you would write your questions in your control panel and ask any questions, and I will relay them to Charlie, and we can answer that. As I'm waiting for that to happen, let me put your, and you may know the answer to a lot of this, but assuming, or let's for a moment assume that Biden is elected. I think if Trump is reelected, we can sort of figure out who his foreign policy team will be. Who do you see as the key players in a Biden foreign policy team?
You know, I think, Tony, that's more likely than not that he gets elected. I'm less worried about the outcome of the vote than I am about what happens after the vote, and the degree to which we could be living through a period of limbo in which the parties are duking it out and maybe taking it to the courts. It's a quite scary scenario, especially given what Trump has said about potentially not accepting the outcome. But I think we know that the people around him, many of them are experienced, seasoned people from the Obama administration. People like Tony Blinken, who's his senior foreign policy advisor. People like Jake Sullivan, who was the vice president's national security advisor in the second term. Susan Rice, Samantha Power. I do expect there to be a reasonably well-represented cohort from the left wing of the party. I don't know if it's Elizabeth Warren or someone else, but I think Joe Biden will want to have a big tent. And one of the more interesting issues to keep an eye on is how he manages the progressive wing of that party, both at home on questions such as health care, on questions such as financial relief for the pandemic, but also on foreign policy, because the progressive wing is much more, I would say, reluctant, particularly on questions of the use of military force, than is the centrist internationalist wing that Biden represents and hails from. And I think he'll want to try to reach out to the Republicans, whether that happens or not. That is to say, whether they reach back or not, I think it's too soon to tell. But he does have a history of banking on bipartisanship. So it'll be very interesting to watch, because he's going to have to manage the progressive wing in his own party at the same time that he tries to establish at least some kind of working relationship with Republicans that have moved pretty far to the right.
Yes, I think that's going to be a serious challenge. So In the questions, one of my former students, Allison Burt, asks, how do we balance? So there's going to need to be an economic rebuilding for the United States and also dealing with climate change. So this is something that, as you know, came up in the debate last night. Trump has taken a particular approach to that, where he's obviously not really focused on climate change, but sort of economic issues. And Biden is trying to do it in a way where there's a balance. How would you recommend that balance be struck?
Well, I think that climate change is here. We used to read about it as this will happen. This is the future that our children will face. Well, it's now front and center. It's happening. And as someone who has young children, I'm very concerned about this. When you and I go to vacation in Bethany or somewhere on the Delaware shore or the Jersey shore, they probably won't exist when my kids are our age, and that's pretty worrying to me. And so this is something we need to get a handle on, not in 10 years, not in 20 years, but today. And I think Biden understands that, and I think he would make fighting climate change a priority. And as he said last night, and he has said before, he would get back into the Paris deal. And even the Paris deal isn't as far-reaching as we need it to be. And I'd also think what we're probably witnessing here is what will end up being a budgetary reallocation. We've seen an over-militarization of American foreign policy. We've been spending a lot of money trying to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio. It hasn't gone particularly well. I think we need to spend more on climate change, on green energy and domestic investment, the future of work, cyber, right? We really need to focus more on these non-traditional threats to security. And I see this being a kind of important issue, trying to reallocate what we spend on the big national security issues towards some of these issues that are non-traditional. They're not going to war, but in many respects, they may be more important to our security than the more traditional conceptions.
That makes, yes. I think there is a reconceptualization that definitely needs to take place. So Ralph Beha asked a specific question. You mentioned China and what people have variously characterized as the rise of China. How should the United States approach China? The Trump administration has sort of taken one path. How do you think a Biden administration should interact with China, given all the dramatic changes that are taking place in its position in the world?
It is one of the, if not the big issue of our time, in the sense that we are moving into a world that will have aspects of bipolarity. That is to say, there will be two big elephants on the global stage, the United States and China, and then plenty of middle-sized powers, the European Union, India, Russia, others. But the two biggest countries will, in many respects, define the geopolitical landscape. And at first blush, I think that it's going to be a rocky road, that policy under Biden wouldn't be that different than policy under Trump, in the sense that there are underlying inescapable conflicts of interest over security in the Western Pacific, territorial issues, human rights, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, you name it, there are very fundamental differences of opinion. The main areas where I think you would see policy change are, first of all, I think Biden would team up economically rather than try to deal with China one-on-one. China does need to change its trade policy. It needs to change its monetary policy. It needs to change its state-owned enterprises. But the way to get it to do that is the U.S. has to line up with Japan and South Korea and Europe and Mexico and Canada. And instead, we've picked a trade fight with everybody. I think Biden would get the idea that we need to lock arms with like-minded states as we press China. Secondly, I think there would be dialogue. There really isn't China policy. There are China tweets. And then we all kind of run around trying to figure out what does Trump mean by that? What does he mean when he says that he thinks she's a great guy? And then the next day he says it's the China virus and they're to blame for everything. I think with Biden, you would have a real effort to have a China policy that is based upon an effort to work with China, if possible, on strategy, on trade, on political issues and human rights. That dialogue has effectively collapsed under the Trump administration. We can't afford that. My final comment is, even though I think we're headed into an era of what you might call renewed bipolarity, it's not going to look like the bipolarity of the US-Soviet era. Decoupling is not going to happen. Interdependent globalization is too far down the road. There may be decoupling in select sectors, 5G, Huawei, some social media issues, but the idea that somehow we're going to go back to a block world of these independent spheres of economic activity, I don't see that happening. And in that respect, it will be a very different kind of bipolarity than the one that we are used to from the 20th century.
That makes good sense. You know, it's interesting. You point to the lack of a China policy, and I wonder if this connects somehow to what we've seen as I don't know what the word is, the marginalization, the denigration of our foreign policy professionals in state and the intelligence community and elsewhere, the NSC for that matter, within the Trump administration.
Well, you know, it's a problem, and there has been a real demoralization. There has been a flight of talent, particularly from the State Department, but also from other federal agencies. And it's in part because they have been, in some cases, fired for speaking up. In other cases, they left because they felt that they were ignored. And they're ignored because there isn't policy. You know, having worked in the White House, I can tell you that the machine generally involves the State Department, the Pentagon, Commerce, the NSA. We all get together, we get our arms around issues, we send papers up the food chain to the president. They gather in the Situation Room, you present the options, and there's a decision. That's not happening, right? It's the opposite. President tweets, and everybody's hair is on fire as they're trying to figure out what to do. And that has led to mass defection because people feel like this is no way to run the government. Is this easy to fix? Yes and no. I mean, I think it will take time to rebuild the ranks of the Foreign Service. On the other hand, we have a deep bench. There are people of real expertise, seasoned people who are now on the outside who could go back in if asked. So I'm really less worried about the dearth of talent at, let's say, the CIA or the State Department than I am about the state of the country politically. That, to me, is going to be the bigger challenge for the next president.
And that makes sense. And, you know, it could be that one of the challenges will be in Congress is that even if you can sort of reinvigorate the professionals in state and DOD and NSC, is how are they then going to be perceived by the Senate and by others, given what we've seen over the past several years where their role had been, you know, completely demoralized and minimized. Another question, and this is, I think, going to be the final question because I want to give you a chance to wrap things up. And this is from a mutual friend of ours, Mairead McCrae. And she's asking, taking us back historically, I think it's a great question. As you look at the U.S. approach that was much more of an isolationist approach, whether it's Washington's farewell address or Jefferson's inaugural, a lot of the isolationism was not getting connected to European events, so staying out of European politics. But there was a Western expansion where the United States engaged, and in many cases violently, and I would go so far as to say in cases through genocide, of the indigenous peoples on the continent. And maybe just to comment a little bit about that, because that was in a sense a sort of a foreign policy, even though it was not a foreign policy towards Europe. How does that figure into your sort of understanding of this American isolationism?
Great question, Mairead. I define isolationism as refusal to expand beyond the mothership. And the mothership to me is North America, but you're very correct to say that when the nation started out, it only had a small chunk of North America. And then over the course of the 19th century, it expanded westward, often not in a way that was consistent with American principles of all people created equal, in the sense that Blacks, Native Americans, Latin Americans suffered grievously. In fact, in the 1640s, the United States picked a war with Mexico and grabbed a big chunk of its territory. That now constitutes the Southwest of the United States. We tried several times to grab Canada. I think many people don't know that. Many times we invaded. And then after the Civil War, William Seward said to the British, "You supported the South, you gave the South ships, you owe us compensation for deaths on the Union side. Thank you very much, we'll take Canada." And the British said, "Oh, no, you won't," but they did pay, I think it was 15 million in compensation. So for me, expansion across the west of the country, settling the country, was brutal. It was expansionist, but it was not, in my mind, counter to isolationism, because we went to the West Coast, we went to the Canadian border, we grabbed stuff from Mexico, and we stopped, right? And we had many debates over the 19th century. Should we take Haiti? Should we take Cuba? Should we take Hawaii? And every time somebody asked that question, the answer was no. And we don't have time to get into why the answer was no, but one of the main reasons is we don't want to risk entanglement in the affairs of either other countries or great power politics. So you're right to point out that we were very expansionist in North America, but I would add extremely not expansionist beyond North America until 1898, when we gave it a try and didn't much like what we got.
That makes good sense. So we have 2 minutes left. Charlie, I feel like I'm Chris Wallace here, and I promise not to interrupt, but 2 minutes to maybe sum it up and leave people with some takeaways about things they might be thinking about in this time of American politics and in this time of the U.S. trying to figure out its engagement of the world.
I guess I'd leave you with two parting thoughts, Tony. One is, this is arguably the most important political moment of our lifetimes. This is an extremely important election. A lot is at stake, some of which we've been talking about over the last 45 minutes. And I take away from this period the realization that, yeah, we have checks and balances, but they don't always do what we thought they would do. And in the end of the day, we have one recourse, and that recourse is the ballot box. And so I would encourage everybody, whatever side you're on in this debate, to get active, to vote, to be politically mobilized, because this is a very important outcome. The second point I'd end with, and this really is the kind of conclusion I arrived at in my book, is that we do need to realize that the country is passing through this important political moment, that in order to avoid what could potentially be a dangerous retreat from our engagement abroad, we need to pull back. We need to engage in what I would call a judicious retrenchment. To put it differently, the United States needs to step back, but not step away. And we need to step back because, in my mind right now, our foreign entanglements are out of kilter with our political will and our domestic means, especially as we suffer through the economic consequences of the pandemic. So we need to reanimate ourselves at home, get our economy going again, rebuild a consensus around international engagement. We got to start with those foundational priorities. And that way, I think we can build a new internationalism, even if a more judicious and selective internationalism for the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you for a great discussion. I encourage everyone, read the Atlantic article. You can do that today. Buy the book. You can do that today online and engage further, as Professor Kupchan says. Well, let us all thank Professor Kupchan for a fascinating discussion. Special thanks to Sarah Adler of the Georgetown University Alumni Association, our Office of Advancement, for all her assistance and technical support. Special shout out to Eleanor Monty Jones. The idea of SFS Online and On Topic was her idea, so we'll always be indebted to her. We will see you all in a couple of weeks for another edition of SFS Online and On Topic. Thank you again so much, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to Eleanor and Sarah and Kelly for organizing. Always a pleasure to do business with you, Tony. I hope next time it's in person.
Me too.